The air in the bank was thick with tension. James Carter sat across from the loan officer, his hands clasped together as he waited for an answer he already knew was coming. The man behind the desk, Richard Holloway, adjusted his tie and exhaled slowly, his expression carefully neutral. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter," Richard said, sliding the papers back across the desk. "After reviewing your application, we regret to inform you that we cannot approve your loan at this time." James clenched his jaw. "Is there a specific reason?" "My credit score is excellent. My business has been profitable for 5 years, and I have the necessary collateral." Richard hesitated, tapping his pen against the desk. "Well, your financials are decent, but we have concerns about the stability of your business model. The market is unpredictable, and we have to mitigate our risks." James inhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay calm. He had been through this before. It was never about the numbers. It was never about the risk. He glanced around the room, noticing how the other clients were treated. Handshakes, warm smiles, easy approvals. But for him, a black entrepreneur with a thriving business, there was always a reason to say no. "I see," James said, his voice measured. He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Mr. Holloway, how many businesses like mine have you approved this year?" Richard shifted uncomfortably. "We don't keep track of approvals by race." James finished for him. "Of course not. That would make things too obvious, wouldn't it?" Richard's face tightened. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. This decision is final." James exhaled, stood up, and straightened his suit. "Understood." He grabbed his briefcase and walked toward the exit, feeling the familiar sting of rejection. But what Richard didn't know was that this wouldn't be the last time they'd meet. Not by a long shot. James Carter walked out of the bank, but he wasn't defeated. Not this time. This wasn't just another rejection. This was fuel that he stepped into his sleek black Mercedes and pulled out his phone. The number he dialed belonged to Victor Langston, his longtime friend and financial advisor. "They denied it," James said, his voice even. Victor sighed on the other end. "Let me guess, some vague excuse about market instability?" "Exactly." There was a pause, then Victor chuckled. "Well, they just made the biggest mistake of their careers. You ready to make a move?" James stared at the bank through his windshield. "Oh, I've never been more ready." For the last 5 years, James had been strategically expanding his business, Carter Innovations, into a multi-million-dollar empire. He had saved, invested, and built strong financial ties. But his ultimate goal was bigger. He wanted ownership, not just participation. And now, the very bank that dismissed him was about to learn a lesson in power that Victor's voice cut through James' thoughts. "The deal with Lexington Financial just finalized this morning." "That means," James smirked, "that means I now own a majority stake in this bank." Silence. Then Victor burst out laughing. "Man, I wish I could be there when they find out." James put the car in drive. "Oh, don't worry. I'll be handling this personally." The following week, the board of directors gathered at Carter and Langston Enterprises for a scheduled meeting with their new majority investor. The men in suits whispered among themselves, each wondering who had acquired such a significant share in the bank. Richard Holloway was among them, feeling unusually nervous. The firm had been struggling, and they desperately needed new investment. Whoever this mysterious investor was, they held the bank's future in their hands. At precisely 10 a.m., the conference room doors opened. James Carter walked in. The room went silent. Richard's face turned pale. His eyes darted around as if looking for an explanation, but there was none. James took his seat at the head of the table, placed his hands together, and smiled. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice calm and commanding, "shall we begin?" A tense silence filled the conference room. The men in suits shifted uncomfortably, their faces betraying their unease. Richard Holloway, the same bank executive who had smugly rejected James's loan application, sat stiffly in his chair. His hands gripped the armrests as if bracing for impact. James leaned back, his expression unreadable. "I'm sure you're all wondering why we're here today." A few murmurs rippled through the room. No one dared to speak directly. James continued, "I won't waste your time. As of last week, I officially own a 51% stake in this institution. That makes me the majority shareholder, which means I now have the final say in how things are run." The weight of his words settled over the table like a thundercloud. Several directors exchanged glances, while Richard swallowed hard. James turned his gaze directly to him. "Mr. Holloway," he said, voice smooth but firm, "I believe we've met before." Richard cleared his throat. "Why, yes, Mr. Carter." James raised a hand, cutting him off. "Just last week, I walked into this very bank and requested a loan from my company. You dismissed me without so much as reviewing my assets. Do you remember what you said to me?" The room was dead silent. Richard hesitated, his jaw tightening. "You told me, and I quote, 'We don't take risks on people like you.'" A collective breath hitched across the table. Some of the directors winced. Others sat rigid, unsure how to react. James let the words hang for a moment before leaning forward, resting his elbows on the table. His eyes locked onto Richard's with an intensity that made the older man shrink back. "Tell me, Mr. Holloway, do you still think I'm a risk?" Richard's face had turned a deep shade of red. He opened his mouth, closed it, then forced a weak chuckle. "Mr. Carter, I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. We have policies, strict policies, that we have to follow." James raised an eyebrow. "Policies?" He tapped the table with his fingers. "Funny how those policies seem to change depending on who's asking for a loan." A few board members shifted awkwardly in their seats. Some were nodding ever so slightly, acknowledging the unspoken truth. James let out a slow breath, then turned his attention to the room as a whole. "Let me be clear, I didn't buy this bank out of spite. I don't have time for petty revenge." He paused, "But I will be making some changes." The tension in the room shifted. Some executives sat up straighter, eager to hear more. James continued. "From this day forward, this bank will operate on fair and ethical practices. No more discrimination. No more rejecting people based on appearances or assumptions. We will judge by merit, not by bias." A few board members exchanged approving nods. Others, like Richard, looked like they had swallowed something bitter. James stood up. "Anyone who has a problem with that is free to resign. Otherwise, we move forward together." The room was silent for a moment. Then slowly, one by one, the executives began to nod. Some even clapped softly. James looked back at Richard. "And as for you," Richard flinched, "I think it's time we had a conversation about leadership." The next morning, headlines across financial news sites blazed with the shocking revelation. Billionaire James Carter becomes majority shareholder of bank that denied him a loan. The story spread like wildfire. Journalists picked apart the irony, how the very institution that had refused to trust James was now under his control. But inside the bank, change was already in motion. James called a company-wide meeting, one that included not just the executives but also the tellers, loan officers, janitors, and security staff. He wanted everyone to hear the message loud and clear. Standing before the assembled employees, James took the microphone. His voice was steady, commanding. "This bank has operated for too long on outdated ideas. Ideas that shut people out instead of lifting them up." He scanned the crowd, his eyes meeting those of employees who had likely suffered under the same discrimination he had faced. "That ends today." The room filled with murmurs of approval. Some clapped, others nodded in agreement. James continued. "Effective immediately, we will be implementing blind application reviews, meaning every loan request will be judged solely on financial merit. No applicant will be dismissed based on their race, gender, or background." A wave of applause spread through the room. "And to ensure this happens, I will be establishing an ethics committee to oversee all major financial decisions." At the back of the room, Richard Holloway sat stiffly, looking like a man watching his empire crumble. His face was pale, his hands clenched together. James turned his gaze toward him. "Which brings me to my final announcement." The room fell silent. There are those in leadership who have stood in the way of fairness, who have upheld discrimination instead of progress. That is unacceptable. A hushed tension filled the space. Everyone knew who he meant. James let the moment stretch before delivering the final blow. "Richard Holloway, your time here is over." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Some employees cheered outright. Others exchanged wide-eyed glances, stunned at the boldness of it all. Richard shot to his feet. Mr. Carter, this is outrageous. You can't just fire me. His voice was shaking. James tilted his head. I own the majority of this bank. I can, and I just did. Security was already moving toward Richard. He turned, his face twisted with anger and disbelief, but no one came to his defense. He was alone. That as the guards escorted him out, James looked back at his employees. This is just the beginning, he said. Together, we will build a bank that works for everyone. The crowd erupted in applause. Months later, the changes at the bank had transformed the institution. Loan approvals became fairer, and new customers, many of whom had been previously turned away, flooded in. James's leadership brought in record-breaking profits. And one day, as James walked into his office, his secretary handed him a letter that it was from a young black entrepreneur. Mr. Carter, I applied for a loan at your bank. I expected rejection, just like I had faced everywhere else. But this time, I was treated with fairness. I received the funding I needed, and now my business is thriving. Thank you for changing the system. Thank you for giving people like me a chance. James smiled. This was the real victory, that he had come full circle, not just proving his worth, but changing the game for others. And that, he knew, was the greatest success of all.